A desperate whisper from a barefoot boy stopped me from walking into a silent killer. He'd risked everything, sleeping behind my trash bins, just to save my life. As I unraveled the sabotage, I discovered a hidden web of broken promises, lost families, and my own buried guilt. But through courage, forgiveness, and rebuilding, we transformed tragedy into hope. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. I had just stepped out of the car when I heard it. "Don't go in that house." The voice cut through the warm Atlanta evening like a blade, sharp, desperate, too loud to ignore. I froze with one foot on the marble step and my hand inches from the door handle. For a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then I turned, and there he was, a barefoot boy, no older than 8, sprinting down my driveway like his life depended on it. He was all bones and motion, shirt hanging off one shoulder, jeans stained dark with something I didn't want to guess. His hat, a once yellow wool thing, drooped over his ears, frayed like a forgotten toy. He ran straight toward me, arms flailing as if trying to wave off a disaster I couldn't yet see. "Please, mister," he panted when he reached me. "You can't go inside. You can't. They messed with your air." I blinked. "What?" His eyes, dark, wide, terrified, met mine. "They broke in last night. 2 men. I saw them under your kitchen counter. One of them said, let's see if a rich man can breathe money. Then they left." I should have called security. I should have shouted at him to get off my property. Hell, any other night I would have done just that. But something about the way his voice trembled held me back. The kid wasn't just scared, he was shaking. His whole body. As if he'd spent the night bracing himself for something horrible to happen. "You're trespassing," I said, but my voice lacked the usual steel. "Who are you?" "Elijah," he answered. "I sleep behind the hydrangeas, by the trash bins." I felt a chill then, not from the air but from the weight of the moment pressing in on my chest. I looked toward the edge of the estate where the privacy fence dipped, just visible between the bushes. $1 million view, I'd always thought. Turns out it had company. "What do you mean they messed with the air?" I asked, my voice quiet. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like the wrong words might set something off. "I don't know exactly. One had tools. He turned something near the stove. The other kept watch. I heard them whisper. They said if someone locked the door, it trapped the air." I didn't waste another second. My hand was already on my phone. 911, I told the dispatcher. "Possible break-in. I need police and fire to my address. There may be a gas leak." I didn't go inside. I didn't take another step. I stood there with that little boy beside me, both of us staring at the closed door like it might open itself and swallow us whole. 15 minutes later, the place was crawling with emergency responders. Sirens had barely stopped wailing when the fire chief, gray-haired, wide-set, all business, stepped out of my house without his helmet. "You're lucky, Mr. Monroe," he said, shaking his head. "There was a leak behind your stove. Slow, but building. Valve was deliberately loosened." My stomach twisted. Would it have caused an explosion? "No," he said, "but with the windows closed, the concentration would have been enough to knock you out within minutes. Lethal within 20. If you'd locked the door behind you." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I looked down at Elijah, who now sat silently on the edge of my steps, his hat balled up in his hands. Shoulders hunched, small knees pulled in like he was trying to disappear. A memory hit me then. I hadn't thought about it in years, didn't want to. My brother Brandon, back when we were young, sitting on the cold floor of an alley downtown, gaunt, shivering, too proud to ask for help, too lost to find his way out. I'd walked past him that day. Said I had a meeting. I never saw him alive again. 12 years later, I was staring at another boy on a different step, and the shame landed hard. I walked over and crouched beside him. He tensed, like he thought I might yell. But I didn't. "Why'd you warn me?" I asked softly. "You could have just walked away." He shrugged, still staring at his shoes. "I saw your face once in a newspaper. Said you donated to my orphanage, Hope House, before it shut down." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a torn newspaper clipping, creased and oily from too many days and too many pockets. And there I was, me, 3 years younger, in front of a massive check, flanked by some nonprofit director I barely remembered. "It was just PR," I muttered, looking at the photo. "I thought maybe you were different," Elijah said. My throat tightened. I took a breath to speak but didn't. What could I say? You hungry? I asked instead. He nodded. Barely. Come inside, I said, standing up. Let's get you something to eat. He hesitated. No more gas, right? I gave a half smile. No, they turned it off. And so we crossed that invisible line. A rich man and a boy who lived behind his trash cans. Two lives that were never supposed to intersect. And yet, that night, under my roof, something started I couldn't explain. A second chance. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the first time I stopped long enough to listen. Elijah sat at the edge of the kitchen stool, like he was afraid it might vanish beneath him. His legs didn't reach the floor, so they dangled in the air, swinging ever so slightly. His small hands clutched that yellow wool hat like it was some kind of talisman, a threadbare shield against a world that hadn't given him much reason to trust it. The kitchen was spotless, silent, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and roasted garlic. Leftovers from a dinner I never got to eat. I stood at the stove, reheating some spaghetti from the fridge, not because I thought it was impressive, but because it was all I had that didn't require fire or skill. The boy had already saved my life. A hot meal was the least I could offer. I set the plate in front of him. It's just spaghetti, I said, trying to sound casual. No mushrooms. Hope that's okay. He blinked. Looks fancy. That made me laugh, quietly, but genuinely. The pasta was just leftovers in a porcelain dish, but I suppose if you've been eating from trash bins, even reheated noodles look like a feast. I handed him a bottle of spring water and leaned back against the opposite counter. He looked at the plate for a second, as if waiting for permission. When I gave him a nod, he dug in, cautiously at first, then with the kind of hunger that clutched at you from the inside out. I watched in silence, not because I was judging him, but because I was trying to understand how this kid had landed in my kitchen, saving my life like it was just another Tuesday. You really used to live at Hope House? I asked, keeping my tones soft. He paused, sauce on his chin. Yeah, Mama dropped me off when we got evicted, said she'd come back when she found a job. His voice went flat. She never did. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly, letting him lead the pace. He wasn't crying, he wasn't even frowning, just stating facts, like someone who had run out of tears a long time ago. They tried to put me in foster care. I ran, he added, chewing slower now. How long have you been on your own? He shrugged. Couple months, maybe? I sleep in places nobody looks. That line stuck in my chest. Places nobody looks. God, how many times had I walked past places nobody looks without blinking? I thought about my own childhood. Gated communities, chauffeurs, Sunday brunches. My biggest worry was whether my polo shirt matched my shoes. I'd never missed a meal, never worried about where I'd sleep. And yet I'd failed the one person who needed me most. Brandon. He'd spiraled fast. Drugs, street life, instability. I wrote checks, sure. Paid for a few rehab stays, but I never actually sat down and listened to him. Not once. I sent money instead of presents. That's what I was good at. I watched Elijah carefully. This wasn't just some fluke. This wasn't charity. It was a second chance, mine, not his. Why did you keep that newspaper? I asked. The one with my picture? He wiped his mouth on the sleeve of his shirt and shrugged. You looked nice in it, like maybe you actually cared. He said it without sarcasm, and it landed like a punch to the gut. He actually meant it. That donation, I said, swallowing hard, it wasn't what it looked like. I only did it to fix a PR mess. I didn't even visit Hope House before that photo. He kept eating, slower now. I still thought maybe you were different. He said it like someone who'd learned to keep a tiny flame of hope alive, even when everything else went dark. I turned to the sink, rinsing a perfectly clean plate just to buy myself a moment. My hands trembled slightly under the water. Where'd you sleep last night? I asked. In the gap behind the bins, he said. It's warm there. Smells bad, but not the worst. I exhaled, steadying myself. You said you saw two men last night? He nodded, setting his fork down. One had a flashlight. The other kept watch. They were quiet, but one of them said something like, "He's gonna sleep deep tonight." That's when I knew it was bad. I stood straighter. You heard that clearly? He nodded again. You stayed until I got home? I didn't want you to die, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Those words slammed into me harder than any security report ever could. A boy with no home, no food, and no reason to care had waited all night, not to steal, not to beg, but to warn me. to save me. "You're not going back out there tonight," I said. He stiffened. "You mean I can stay?" "Yes, just for tonight," I said, then softened. "We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." I showed him the guest room. It wasn't much. White sheets, a nightlight, and a stack of folded towels. He stepped inside like he'd been transported to another planet. "There's a shower if you want one," I said. "I'll leave a clean shirt outside the door." He turned back to look at me. "You're really nice for a rich guy?" I smiled. "Don't let that get around. I've got a reputation to protect." He laughed, really laughed, a quick burst of sound so pure and startled that it nearly broke me. I stood in the hallway for a while after that, listening to the sound of water running. He was singing in the shower. Off-key, joyful, free. Later that night, I sat alone in my study. The TV was on mute. The news had picked up the gas leak story already, using grainy security footage of me outside the door with Elijah running toward me like a ghost out of the dark. A headline rolled across the screen: "CEO targeted in sabotage plot." I muted the TV and looked down at the clipping Elijah had left on my desk, the same one he'd carried in his pocket, believing it meant something. Me, smiling beside a giant check, thinking I was doing enough. I thought about the kid I'd once walked away from, and the kid upstairs sleeping in my house, still unsure if he'd be allowed to stay come morning. I'd been given a second chance. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not because of an alarm, but because something inside me refused to let me sleep. A kind of weight, thick and persistent, had settled on my chest. I sat on the edge of my bed, elbows on my knees, staring down at the hardwood floor while a shaft of morning light crept across it. Something had changed. And it wasn't just the near death from gas poisoning. It was heavier than that. Older. Maybe it had been waiting years to surface. The smell of toast caught my attention. Toast? I hadn't made toast I couldn't remember. No one touched the toaster in this house. My housekeeper didn't arrive until noon. I walked downstairs quietly, barefoot, half expecting nothing, and found Elijah standing at the counter with a plastic knife in his hand, spreading butter over a slice of toast with meticulous care. He was wearing one of my old shirts, Brandon's, actually. It hung off him like a curtain, sleeves rolled up past his elbows, one still slipping over his hand. He looked up and gave me a sheepish grin. "Morning." I raised an eyebrow, hiding a smile. "Didn't expect you to be up." "I was hungry," he said simply. "And you said I could stay, so I figured maybe toast was okay." "You figured right." He placed another slice on a smaller plate and held it up. "Want one?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." We sat together at the kitchen island, chewing in silence. There was something about it, something gentle. A simple morning, no distractions, no calls, no press briefings. Just breakfast with a kid who had no reason to trust me and every reason not to. After a few bites, I leaned back. "Elijah, I want to ask you something serious." He froze mid-chew, eyes flicking up to mine. "Those two men, if I showed you some photos, do you think you could recognize either of them?" His face tensed. "Maybe. I didn't see much. One had a flashlight. The other, I think he had a scar, just below his eye, and he walked with a limp." My heart skipped. That wasn't nothing. That was more detail than I expected. I stood and walked briskly to my office, grabbed my laptop, and brought it back to the counter. I opened a folder of archived incident reports, ones my company had received over the years and filed away. Most were minor complaints, but some stuck in memory, one in particular. I pulled up a photo, grainy, taken outside our development office during a protest nearly 2 years ago. A cluster of angry tenants, signs raised, shouting. In the center, a man with a sunburnt neck and a jagged scar just beneath his right eye. Elijah leaned forward. "That's him." I stared at the screen. I remembered the event vaguely. My assistant had called security. The man had refused to leave until someone from corporate came to speak with him. I never did. I was too busy. His name was Reuben Miles. He'd been a subcontractor, an electrician, licensed, competent. But he lived in a row house community we'd acquired for redevelopment. The moment the papers were signed, those homes were slated for demolition. Evictions followed. Reuben had fought it. He'd written letters, emails, even showed up to the office in person. I hadn't read his letters. I just knew the situation had been handled. Apparently it hadn't. Elijah looked at me. "You okay?" "No," I said honestly. "I'm not." I had been building skyscrapers, market-rate condos, luxury high-rises, places I called revitalization. But what were they really? Marble countertops over bulldozed families? Steel and glass tombstones for people like Robin? I was supposed to help people, I muttered. I thought I was creating jobs, upgrading neighborhoods. But maybe all I built were quiet disasters in granite trim. Elijah didn't understand the metaphor, but he felt the tension. I could see it in his face, so I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. A private investigator I'd hired during a corporate merger, back when I needed to quietly vet competitors. I trusted him. He worked fast. I need everything you can dig up on a man named Reuben Miles, I told him. Background, address, past complaints, especially anything filed against Monroe Development. Give me a few hours, he said. You want this quiet? Very. When I hung up, Elijah was looking at me curiously. You're not like I thought, he said. Meaning? I thought rich people never looked back, but you're looking. That hit me harder than I expected. I knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. I missed something important once, I told him. I missed it with my brother. I'm not missing it again. He nodded like he didn't quite believe me, but wanted to. A few hours later, the report arrived. 47, former electrician, evicted 16 months ago from South Atlanta, filed 2 appeals, both denied. Car impounded, no current employment, no known relatives. Single father. His son, Jacob, placed into state custody after the eviction. And buried deep in our records was a scanned copy of a sealed letter Reuben had written to Monroe Development. The subject line read, "Wrongful displacement, request for restitution." It had never reached my desk, marked non-urgent, then archived. I printed the letter and read it at my desk in full. It was 2 pages, typed, signed in handwriting at the bottom that slanted slightly to the right. It wasn't angry, it was pleading. My son is 9. He doesn't understand why we sleep in a car. I tell him it's temporary. I tell him men like you don't mean harm. Please don't make me a liar. I read that line 3 times, and each time it landed harder than the last. Elijah's voice came through the hallway intercom. Mr. Monroe, I think I left my hat in the guest room. Is it okay if I go get it? I pressed the intercom button. Of course. As the line clicked off, I stared at the folded letter on my desk and thought about how close I'd come to dying, and how a boy who'd once believed I looked kind in a newspaper photo had saved me, not just from gas poisoning, but from my own ignorance. I looked at the screen again, at Reuben's face in that photo, surrounded by people I never saw, and I made a decision, not just to protect Elijah, not just to respond to the threat, but to finally see what I'd spent years pretending wasn't there. I wasn't going to write a check. I was going to do something real. That night, I stood outside Elijah's door, holding a clean shirt folded over my arm and listening to the soft hum of his breathing on the other side. He was asleep. I could hear it. The steady rhythm of a child at peace, or something close to it. After so many nights curled up behind dumpsters, he was finally sleeping in a bed with clean sheets, a nightlight glowing gently, and silence that didn't threaten. I placed the shirt on a chair outside his door and walked back to my study, my mind not resting with the rest of the house. The report on Reuben Miles was still open on my desk. His face stared out from the screen, frozen in that photo from the protest, eyes sunken, jaw clenched, not in rage but in despair. I'd known his name in passing, a line on a spreadsheet, a file I'd never bothered to open. But now it was all I could think about. I needed to see him, in person. The next morning, I told Elijah I had a meeting and left without saying much else. I didn't want him to worry, didn't want to promise anything I couldn't keep. I drove myself, no driver, no assistant, and followed the address the investigator had sent me. A worn-down duplex on the south side, tucked behind a boarded-up tire shop, sagging porch steps, and faded siding like the skin of a house trying to survive winter in the middle of July. A man sat out front on the steps, smoking a cigarette, his face drawn and lined. There was no mistaking the scar just below his right eye. "Reuben?" I asked. He looked up slowly, squinted through the sunlight, and when he recognized me, he didn't get up. "You're a long way from Buckhead, Monroe," he said, voice low, smoky. "I came to talk. You came to ease your conscience." "Maybe," I admitted, "but mostly I came to tell you you were right." He snorted and took a long drag, blowing the smoke sideways. "You think saying that fixes something? No, I said, but I think not saying it has broken more than I can measure. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gestured toward the steps. You've got 10 minutes. I sat beside him, the wood beneath me splintered and warm from the sun. You wrote a letter, I said. I never read it. It was filed under non-urgent. That was a failure, my failure. He didn't look at me, just stared at the concrete below. I begged your people, he said. I begged them for a meeting, for help. My kid, he had asthma, coughing blood from the mold in that place. They told me relocation was coming. You know what that meant? It meant I had 2 weeks and a lock change. I swallowed, my throat dry. There were no words, no excuse. I offered to help, he continued. Said I'd wire your condos for free if it gave us a week. They laughed. Security dragged me out. I remember the report, I said quietly. But I never saw your name, not until yesterday. You didn't have to, he muttered. That's the kind of power you've got. You can ruin lives without even noticing. I nodded slowly. I know now, and I can't undo what happened, but I want to make it right. He looked at me for the first time, eyes hard and hollow. Why now? I hesitated, then said, because I almost died, because someone tried to kill me. And the only reason I'm alive is because a little boy who sleeps behind my trash cans waited all night to warn me. A boy who kept a photo of me in his pocket because he thought I looked kind. Reuben stared. Then slowly, he stubbed out his cigarette and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Pulled out a folded paper. This better not be another promise, he warned. I handed him my own. A proposal, a start. I'm launching a new fund. Second breath. Housing, legal support, job placement, real infrastructure, not just for show, and I want your voice in it. No press, no speeches, just input, real work. He didn't open it, just held it in his hands like it might bite him. My son, he said quietly. He's in foster care, won't talk to me, thinks I'm a failure. I looked him in the eye, then maybe we start there with getting him back. His fingers curled tighter around the paper. You'd help? If that's what you want, I said, yes. He didn't answer right away, but after a long pause he nodded. You get one shot. That's all I need. As I drove back to my house, I felt something shift. Not absolution, but maybe the beginning of penance. Elijah was in the backyard, barefoot on the grass, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. He didn't look up when I stepped onto the patio, just kept moving the stick in small, deliberate circles. How was your meeting? He asked, finally glancing up. Hard, I said, but important. Was he mad at you? He should be, I replied, but he listened. Good, he said, stabbing the stick into the dirt. You gonna help him now? I am, I said. He nodded once. That's what heroes do. I smiled faintly. I don't think I'm a hero, Elijah. He walked over and leaned against me. You're trying. That counts. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I sat in the hallway just outside his room, the yellow hat in my lap. It was warm from his hands, worn down from years of being pulled tight against the world. He'd left it behind, but I knew it wasn't by accident. An hour later, I heard his voice from inside the room. Quiet, almost a whisper. Please don't kick me out tomorrow. My hand clenched around the hat. You're not going anywhere, I whispered back, though he couldn't hear me. Not now, not ever. I stayed there until the silence felt like peace, not avoidance. And for the first time in years, I stopped running. I wasn't just fixing the leak that almost killed me. I was fixing something far deeper. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally learning how to stay. The next morning, the light in my home felt different. Less clinical, less cold. Maybe it was the spring sun slipping through the windows just right, or maybe it was the sound of Elijah's feet on the stairs, not tiptoeing this time, but walking with a little more certainty. He was humming under his breath, off-key but happy, and for a brief second, I didn't feel like a man with 1,000 regrets. I sat in the kitchen, coffee in hand, flipping through a stack of folders retrieved from a storage unit beneath my office. I hadn't touched them in years. Most were labeled in monotone fonts: community response logs, relocation orders, tenant claims, South District reports. Bureaucratic camouflage for pain. I opened one at random and stared at the first page. Displacement hearing, Freeman Reuben. I kept reading. Letters, complaints, testimonies, all of them stamped as processed or resolved, without ever being read by me. I had trusted assistants, policy briefings, middlemen, and in the process I'd built entire silos of silence. Whole communities were erased with nothing but a filing system and a polite email. I looked up and saw Elijah, perched on a stool, munching toast and flipping through an old National Geographic I didn't even know I owned. He looked like a kid who belonged there. And maybe that was the most miraculous part. "I want to show you something," I told him. He looked up, crumbs on his chin. "Is it more maps?" "No," I smiled, "but I'll make sure it has porches." He didn't get the joke, not yet, but he followed me to the dining room where I'd laid out blueprints on the table. "This," I said, unrolling a large sheet, "is going to be the future of that empty lot near your old neighborhood. Not condos, not luxury anything, homes, affordable, clean, accessible, and we're naming the community center Elijah Hall." He stared at the paper for a long time before speaking. "You're serious?" "As serious as the gas leak," I said. He laughed, then quickly looked guilty. "Sorry." "No," I said. That was the right response. That afternoon, I made a series of calls. First, to my legal team, shaky, resistant, asking about investors and profit margins. I shut that down quick. "I'm not in the business of bleeding the people we displaced anymore," I told them. "I'm in the business of earning back trust. Start the paperwork." Then I called Grace. Reverend Loretta Grace had known my family longer than I had. She baptized me as a baby, scolded me as a teenager, and nearly slapped me when I sent a donation check to Hope House instead of showing up. She answered the phone like she already knew I was calling. "Took you long enough?" she said. "You finally ready to show up without a camera crew?" "I'm not calling for publicity," I replied. "I'm rebuilding Hope House, and I need someone who knows what healing actually looks like." There was a pause, a long one. Then she said, "I'll come, but only if you promise me something. Anything. These kids don't need heroes, they need people who show up when no one's watching." "Deal," I said without hesitation. Later that evening, Elijah sat in the sunroom with his treasure box between his knees. It was just a small cardboard container, worn soft at the corners. Inside were items only he could understand. A photograph from the newspaper, a plastic dinosaur with a missing leg, a pebble he'd picked up from the park, and the letter I'd written to the adoption agency but hadn't yet submitted. "Do you think stuff like this matters?" he asked. "What do you mean?" He held up the photo of his mom, then the little rock. "These things, they're not worth anything." "They are if they matter to you," I said. "Value isn't always about price tags." He nodded and placed the lid back on the box, sealing it like it was a vault. Before bed, I handed him a form. "Tomorrow we have a meeting with Miss Hart from Child Services. I'm filing for temporary guardianship. First step." Elijah's eyes grew wide. "You mean like you're really keeping me?" "I mean I'm not letting you disappear." He threw his arms around my neck so fast I nearly dropped the paperwork. "I was scared you'd change your mind," he whispered. "I was scared I wouldn't get the chance to," I whispered back. The next morning, we sat in Miss Hart's office. She looked overwhelmed, most social workers are, but her face softened when she saw Elijah. "You've grown," she said, kneeling to eye level. "We all remember the quiet ones." She pulled out a thick manila folder. Elijah's case was flagged for reassignment after he ran. 3 foster homes in 9 months. His file was marked inactive until your call. "Why'd you run?" I asked gently. "They didn't talk to me," Elijah said. "They just fed me and locked the door at night, from the outside." Hart nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, not uncommon." "I'd like to file for emergency guardianship," I said. "Now." "That's a big step," she replied. "He saved my life," I said. "This is the least I can do." She studied us for a moment, then reached for a stack of forms. "Let's begin." By evening, the paperwork was signed. Elijah clutched the yellow hat in his lap like it was the only thing anchoring him. "What does this mean?" he asked. "It means," I said, kneeling in front of him, "you're not just a guest anymore." He blinked, hard, then lunged forward and wrapped me in a hug that felt more permanent than any document ever could. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because of anxiety, but because, for the first time in years, I felt awake in every sense of the word. Awake to the world, to pain, to possibility. And as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the plans for Elijah Hall, I realized something I hadn't dared admit out loud yet. I wasn't building this for Elijah alone. I was building it for Brandon, for Reuben, for all the families we displaced in the name of revitalization. I was building it for myself too, so I'd never forget what it felt like to stop running and start repairing. Because forgiveness doesn't come from saying sorry. It comes from staying, from showing up, from trying again. And in the morning, I would keep trying. The park sat quietly at the edge of the city, hidden behind brick buildings and a crumbling iron fence. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a postcard. Patches of grass worn thin, a fountain that hadn't worked in years, and a playground with more rust than paint. But kids still ran barefoot across the mulch, and mothers watched from benches, their chatter blending with the distant hum of traffic. I sat beside Elijah on a wooden bench near the tree line, sipping coffee from a paper cup and letting the rare warmth of a spring morning soak into my bones. He wasn't saying much, just watching the field ahead like it was telling him a story only he could hear. That's when he spoke. "That's her," he said quietly. I followed his gaze to a woman sitting cross-legged in the grass. She was playing a guitar, her fingers clumsy on the strings, her voice fragile but clear. There was something raw about it, like someone relearning how to speak through song. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. But when I looked closer, really looked, I saw the resemblance. "You sure?" I asked. "I remember her hands," Elijah whispered. "She used to sing when she braided my hair." I turned back to the woman. Her song drifted on the breeze, imperfect but filled with something that made my chest ache. "Do you want to go to her?" Elijah didn't answer right away. His fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of his yellow hat. His breathing got shallower, like his body didn't know whether to run or reach forward. "Not yet," he finally said. "Can we just sit?" "Of course," I said. So we sat. Minutes passed, then an hour. She kept playing, unaware of the boy who hadn't seen her in nearly a year, the boy who thought she'd vanished for good. When Elijah finally stood, he moved slowly. His feet were unsure, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his hoodie. I didn't follow. I stayed on the bench, watching. He crossed the field one step at a time until he was just a few feet from her. She looked up, eyes squinting against the sun. Her fingers froze on the guitar strings. Then she dropped the instrument and covered her mouth with both hands. "Elijah?" she choked out. He nodded, his face locked between hope and fear. She reached out with shaking arms, and he fell into them. From where I sat, I couldn't hear what they said, but I didn't need to. I saw it in the way her shoulders shook, in the way he pressed his face into her neck like a little boy again. She held him like she was trying to memorize his weight. Eventually, they sat together, cross-legged on the grass, heads bowed close. He showed her something from his pocket, probably the photo from his treasure box. She smiled, touched his cheek, and sang a few soft notes into the wind. When he returned to me, his eyes were glassy but bright. "She's been clean 6 months," he said. "She didn't come back because she thought she'd ruin me." I nodded. "Do you want to see her again?" He gripped his hat with both hands. "Yeah, but I still want to stay home with you." "You're allowed to have both," I said. "Family doesn't have to be either or." That night, Elijah added a new photo to his box. A picture of him and his mother sitting in front of the broken fountain. She was smiling. He was too. Alongside it, he placed a small pebble he'd picked up from the park. "I think this means things don't stay broken forever," he said, tracing the stone's smooth edge. I didn't respond. I just placed a hand on his shoulder as I tucked him in. He turned toward the window, watching the sky darken, and whispered one more thing before drifting off to sleep. "I think I can stop pretending now." I sat with that sentence long after he fell asleep. Sat in the quiet of the hallway outside his door, watching the shadows on the floor lengthen as the moon crept across the sky. In the morning, we went back to Hope House. This time, it was different. The place had changed. Scaffolding framed the front entrance, paint cans stacked near the door. The windows were open, and you could hear music playing faintly from inside. Real music, not for show. Volunteers buzzed through the hallways carrying books, furniture, posters. I spotted one woman with pink hair painting a mural of children holding lanterns under a night sky. Another was restocking a bookshelf with titles like How to Build a Garden and Understanding Big Feelings. "Looks better," Elijah said quietly, holding my hand. "It will be," I said. "We're naming the new wing after you." He stopped walking. "Me?" "Elijah Hall," I said, "for kids who never got a real chance but gave one anyway." He flushed deep red and looked down at his shoes. "Can it have beanbags?" It'll have whatever you want, I said with a grin. Later that day, he and I sat on the porch back at home, the air full of honeysuckle and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe belonging. He opened his treasure box again and took out the new photo. He held it next to the old newspaper clipping of me holding the check outside the old Hope House. You looked different back then, he said. I was, I admitted. He tilted his head. Do you think my mom can stay clean? I think people surprise us, I said. Especially when someone believes in them. He leaned back, arms behind his head, gaze on the sky. I think you surprised yourself, Mr. Monroe. I smiled. I think you're right. The sun dipped low, casting long golden streaks across the porch and the yard. The kind of light that made everything feel like it might just hold. Elijah rolled over and whispered something to the breeze. Please let this be real. I didn't say anything. I just stayed beside him. Because it was real. And it was only the beginning. The morning of the ceremony arrived quietly, without any fanfare, just as I wanted it. No red carpet, no polished podium, no catered brunch served on fine china. Just folding chairs lined in crooked rows beneath a white canopy on the old Hope House lot. The late spring breeze tugged gently at the corners of a navy blue banner that hung from the scaffolding above the front doors. It read, in bold lettering, Elijah Hall. A place to begin again. I stood near the entrance, the newly finished wing at my back, and a small, folded speech in my hand that I wasn't sure I'd use. I hadn't written it for applause. I'd written it because I owed the truth to the people gathered there. Elijah sat in the front row, swinging his legs nervously, wearing the gray hoodie we'd bought last week and a clean pair of jeans. His yellow knit hat, faded now and fraying, was perched proudly on his head, even though the sun was warm. He glanced at me occasionally, not with fear this time, but with the kind of silent expectation that comes when someone believes you'll show up. The crowd was a mix of the familiar and the quietly courageous. Victor Miles stood a few rows back, stiff in a navy jacket, with his son Jacob at his side. Awkward, quiet, but present. Reverend Grace stood off to one side, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like a protective sentinel. Miss Hart from Child Services chatted with two volunteers near the doors. Even some of the kids from the new intake group were there, gripping juice boxes and wondering if this was another one of those things grown-ups did before forgetting them again. The mayor gave a short speech, diplomatic, polished, full of city statistics and keywords like partnership and revitalization. I listened with half an ear, but my eyes never left Elijah. He was fiddling with something in his hands, a paperclip, maybe, or the corner of a napkin, and I knew that whatever I said next, it needed to mean something to him. When it was my turn, I stepped away from the mayor's microphone and didn't bother unfolding my speech. I walked to the center of the gathering, clipped a mic to my collar, and looked out at everyone, not from a stage but from the ground. 6 months ago, I began. I didn't know Elijah. I didn't know Victor. I didn't know half the people standing here today, but I thought I knew what leadership looked like. A murmur ran through the crowd. I kept going. I thought leadership meant meetings, metrics, margins. I thought it meant giving a speech, signing a check, and letting someone else handle the fallout, but I didn't know what community meant. I turned slightly, letting my eyes find Elijah again. He looked up, blinking fast. His eyes were already glassy. A little boy reminded me, I said. Not with a lecture, not with a demand, just with a whisper, with 5 words, don't go in that house. Silence. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. I'm not proud of how long it took me to listen, I continued, or how many people I hurt along the way by not seeing them, but I am proud that we're here, and I'm proud that this place, Elijah Hall, isn't a monument to guilt, it's a promise. I turned back to the crowd, a promise that the invisible will be seen, that second chances don't expire, that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes, it begins with a child who shouldn't have had to carry that kind of weight, but did. The crowd was still for a long moment. Then, softly at first, the sound of clapping rose like a tide, tentative, unsure, and then louder. But I didn't bask in it. I stepped off to the side, back to Elijah, and knelt beside his seat. I have something for you, I said, handing him a small square envelope. He opened it slowly, pulling out a thick certificate with a gold-embossed seal at the bottom. He read the words silently, then looked up at me. You adopted me? he whispered, barely able to get the words out. I nodded, tears burning at the edges of my vision. As of this morning, it's official. His mouth fell open, and then he flung his arms around me, knocking the paper from his lap. You mean I really get to stay forever? Forever, I said. No more running. Behind us, Victor stepped forward. He didn't speak at first, just shook my hand. Then, unexpectedly, pulled me into a hug, brief, firm, real. I saw Jacob smile today, he murmured. First time in almost 2 years. I squeezed his shoulder. It's just the beginning. That evening, Elijah and I sat on the front steps of the house under the glow of the porch light. The neighborhood was unusually still, scented faintly with jasmine and charcoal smoke from someone's backyard grill. He had his treasure box open between us. Inside were all the pieces of his story. The newspaper clipping with my old photo, a plastic dinosaur missing a leg. The photo of him and his mom at the park. A pebble from the fountain. The adoption certificate. He picked up each item slowly, running his fingers over them like sacred objects. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything that day? I asked. He nodded. Sometimes, I think you'd be gone. And I'd still be behind the bins, and maybe I wouldn't have talked to anyone again. My throat tightened. You gave me more than my life, Elijah. He reached into the box again and held up the yellow hat. This is the only thing I had for a long time, he said. When I didn't feel like a real person, I'd pull it down over my eyes and pretend I was someone who mattered. He held it out to me. Can you keep it now? I blinked. Are you sure? I don't need it anymore, he said, because now I know I matter. I took the hat like it was made of gold. Held it against my chest. You always did, I whispered. We sat in silence for a long time, just the two of us and the warm night air. From the edge of the lawn, motion sensor lights flicked on. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Home, not because of the house, not because of the success or the money, but because someone had finally seen me, and I had finally seen them back. And this boy, who once lived behind my trash bins, had become my son. 3 days after the ceremony, the morning sun spilled through the tall windows of our home, casting golden lines across the marble floors like threads pulling the day into motion. The house, once sterile and echoing, was now a hive of quiet purpose. Contractors shuffled in and out, the front door revolving with deliveries, blueprints, and inspections. A second team reviewed staff applications for Hope House's expansion. My kitchen table, once a lonely slab of wood, was now buried beneath stacks of orientation packets and grant forms. In the middle of it all sat Elijah, at the island counter, legs swinging, a half-eaten banana in one hand and a glass of orange juice in the other. He watched me pace the living room, phone glued to my ear. Yes, I want those units permanently rent-controlled, I snapped into the receiver. No, I don't care what the investors say. We're not in the business of squeezing the people we displaced. I ended the call with a sigh and caught Elijah grinning over his juice. You didn't sleep, did you? He said, like it was a joke we'd both rehearsed. Not much, I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. You talk in your sleep, he added, biting into his banana. I do? Yeah. Last night you said, ceiling fans in every unit or I'm walking. Despite everything, I laughed. Sounds about right. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Victor Miles standing there, cleaner than I'd ever seen him. Faded jacket zipped, a folder tucked under his arm. His expression was cautious but not hostile. You said you wanted my input, he said. You meant it? I stepped aside. Come in. Victor spotted Elijah as soon as he entered. The boy perked up instantly. Hey, you're the guy with the scar, Elijah said, mouth still full of banana. Victor blinked. Then, surprisingly, smiled. Yeah, that'd be me. I gestured toward the dining table. Let's talk. Elijah hovered. You want me to go? No, I said. You stay. Victor gave me a look, half curious, half wary. He deserves to see what rebuilding looks like, I said. Victor nodded once, then laid out the folder on the table. Inside were rough sketches, diagrams, and notes scrawled in blue ink and highlighter, none of it polished, all of it earnest. We need a daycare center, Victor said, tapping the paper. On site, you want single parents to make it? They can't do it without childcare. I nodded, writing it down. And no more damn Whole Foods, he added. Put in a corner market. One that takes Snap. Elijah chimed in, and porches. Victor raised an eyebrow. Porches? The boy nodded. So people can talk to each other again, not just stare at screens. Victor smiled at him. You're a smart kid. They went back and forth for an hour, and when it was done, I stood, extended my hand, and said, "Let's build it your way." Victor studied me for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook my hand. Later that afternoon, I took Elijah back to Hope House. The new wing was humming with progress. Fresh paint on the walls, beanbags in the reading room just like he'd asked for, and a large plaque already mounted outside the entrance that read, "The Elijah Hall. For the ones who dared to believe again." He stood there for a long time, staring up at it like he wasn't quite sure it was real. Inside, he wandered into the corner of the playroom and sat down, quietly flipping through a book someone had shelved just that morning. "You don't have to pretend to be okay all the time," I said, kneeling beside him. He looked at the floor. "I know. It just feels like, if I stop smiling, someone might send me back." I touched his shoulder gently. "You're not going back. This," I gestured around the room, "this is forward now. All of it." That night, I stood in my office, looking out at the city skyline. I used to measure that view in dollars, in floor plans, square footage, revenue streams. Now I saw shadows of what we'd lost, and maybe what we were slowly beginning to find again. The intercom buzzed. "There's a reporter downstairs from the Journal," my assistant said. "Wants to do a story on the boy who saved the CEO." I pressed the button. Tell her no? But if she wants to write about Hope House or the kids here, I'll make time. On my way down the hall, I peeked into Elijah's room. He was already asleep, curled up with a teddy bear I didn't recognize, probably donated, worn, but clearly treasured. His arm was thrown over it protectively, his face soft and peaceful. I turned off the light and paused in the hallway, facing the framed photo of Brandon on the wall. My brother, young, defiant, alive, his smile still whole, untouched by the streets that would later consume him. "For what it's worth," I whispered, "I think I'm finally listening." 2 weeks after the reopening of Hope House, Victor saw his son again. The meeting was held in a small, sunlit room at the group home. No cameras, no press, just 2 folding chairs and a table between them. I waited in the hallway with Elijah, who sat beside me on a bench, legs swinging. "You think Jacob will talk to him?" Elijah asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I think showing up matters more than saying the perfect thing." Inside the room, Victor stood awkwardly near the window as Jacob walked in, taller than I expected, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his hoodie. He didn't say a word, just stared. Victor didn't push. After nearly a minute, he said, "You look taller." Jacob shrugged. "I eat better now." Victor nodded slowly. "That's good." Another silence. Then, finally, Jacob asked, "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" Victor's voice cracked. "Because I thought I'd already lost you." Jacob didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. And for now, that was enough. That night, Elijah and I stopped by a small diner off I-75. We sat in a booth with torn leather seats, pancakes for dinner, and the smell of burnt coffee floating in the air. "You can order something else, you know," I told him. "I don't want anything else," he said, smiling through syrup. "This isn't cheap. It's perfect." Back at home, I received an email from the mayor's office. They wanted to recognize my work with the community at an upcoming civic awards event. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I closed the laptop. Instead, I walked into Elijah's room. He was flipping through a photo album I'd given him, a collection of his first days at Hope House, the ceremony, the porch photo, the park. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of a younger me with my arm around someone else. "That's Brandon," I said, sitting beside him. "My brother. That was the last photo we took together." He looked up. "You think he'd be proud of you now?" I thought about it. "I think he'd ask what took me so long." Elijah grinned. "Well, I'm glad you got here anyway." The next morning, we visited the park again. The same patch of green, the same broken fountain. Children ran wild across the field, and near the tree line, a woman sat with a guitar in her lap, quietly singing to herself. "That's her." Elijah whispered, "That's my mom." I turned to him. "Are you sure?" "I remember her hands," he said again. "You want to go to her?" He hesitated. "Not yet. Let's just sit." And so we sat, quietly, together, watching healing from across the grass, learning that it doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, in simple truths, in the love between a boy and a man who once almost lost everything and now had each other. Forever. Thank you truly for staying with me through this journey. If you're still here, it means this story meant something to you. And maybe, like me, you believe that the smallest voices can carry the loudest truths. Elijah wasn't a politician, a leader, or a man of influence. He was just a boy with nothing but courage. And yet he saved a life. Not just mine, but countless others we failed to see. The lesson? Sometimes the ones the world overlooks are the ones who end up changing everything. We're never too successful, too busy, or too late to make things right. Now I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people around the world are listening with you right now. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories coming. Stories that heal, reveal, and remind us what truly matters. Let's keep listening. Let's keep building. One story at a time. See you in the next one.